Thank you so much. So today I'm going to talk to you about accessibility in your app and specifically how that can increase your product quality by focusing on that. Just a note to start, if you want to continue to have discussions about this in Slack afterwards, feel free to join the Slack channel that we have for this. I have it down at the bottom of the slide, session chat D1S5T2. Then with that, let's get going. Another note that I wanted to share is that we're going to try to make this talk a little bit interactive. So if you've been passively watching your talks, this is your chance to get engaged. We're going to use a tool called Menti to do that. So if you go to menti.com and type in this code, then you're able to access this shared word cloud that we're going to put together. So once you are there, you can type in words here that you might think are key points when you're listening to this talk. I will also have prompts for you. So as you are going to menti.com, typing in this code, and when you get there, just to test it out, feel free to put in any words that you think of when you think about accessibility, and they will show up here. Thank you for dropping that in the chat. It is also in the chat, and then it's in like the tiny text at the bottom of my slides. So while you're doing that, let's start talking about what is accessibility. We'll go back to the cloud throughout the presentation so we can see what everyone is adding. And accessibility is a lot of things. In short, it's a way to make your app available to use by more people. So an app is accessible if anyone can use it independently without assistance from another person. So what this is saying is they can use any accessibility services to navigate the app if they're using those services, whether that's TalkBack or, just magnified text. There's different services that people use, and you want to make sure that people can use it with those services. And this is largely thought of about when it comes to supporting people with disabilities, such as vision, hearing, motor, as well as cognitive and mental health disorders. As you'll see in this talk, it also brings a lot of benefits to all of your users, everyone who is using your app. So that brings us to why should you care about accessibility? And there are a lot of reasons for this, from product to personal to legal. So let's start with product. As I mentioned, when you make an accessible app, it creates a better experience for everyone. This includes people with disabilities who are using these accessibility services, but also it helps people with temporary disabilities, such as if someone just had their eyes dilated, if they broke their wrists and they're in a wrist brace, if they're driving and really shouldn't be looking at their screen, and other everyday things like if you have your hands full carrying groceries. It also helps with keyboard navigation, especially if you want to support Chromebooks. By supporting keyboard navigation for accessibility, you can more easily support Chromebooks or port over to a TV app. If you've ever used Escape to close a modal, or Enter to submit a form, or Tab to advance to the next form field, these are the things that you're able to support by making your app accessible. Some other things that help with accessibility, but also the enjoyment of all users, is having the option to have captions on videos. So you can listen to it without the sound if you want, or if you can't hear it for one reason or another, whether you have a hearing impairment or you're just in a really noisy place. Customization, whether that's dark mode or audio settings. Having your phone vibrate instead of ring is also an accessibility feature. And it also means you have more consistent and predictable layouts and user experience. You can also reach a wider audience by supporting accessibility. People with disabilities represent one of the largest minority groups. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 adults in the US have some type of disability. And by catering to this group, you have access to a larger user base, and that's always a great thing. Supporting accessibility can also drive innovation. Creating apps for accessibility does mean working within some constraints, like maybe you can't fit as much content on the screen. This means you have to really think about what's important and where it's located, making it a better experience for everyone. You're much more intentional, and it brings out that creativity when you have more constraints to work within. And then there's legal reasons. This one isn't the most fun for me to speak about, but it's a very compelling reason, because the reality is that there can be lawsuits because your app isn't accessible. So it's great to support those accessibility guidelines before there's a lawsuit. And then my favorite one to talk about is just because it's the right thing to do. Everyone should be allowed to have the same experience and the same access to your app. We want to be an inclusive society that takes care of our neighbors. Imagine being in a situation where you want to order some food. You can't run out to the store right now to get some food. Maybe you just got a new puppy that needs constant watching right now. And you want the app to be something that you can access no matter what services you're using to access it. All right, so here is the next question for you to add to our word cloud, and that is, how can you test for accessibility improvements? And maybe who is able to test for accessibility improvements? So while we're thinking about that, go ahead, go back to menti.com with that code if you're not already there, and kind of answer those questions. And we're going to talk about these answers in just a moment here as I go to the next slide. An answer to who can test for accessibility improvements is really anyone who is willing to. Anyone can learn the tools to start making initial investigations into what can be improved. Yes, some people will have more experience with the tools and really know what's needed, but anyone who's interested in it can start to learn whether they're interested in the basics, learn how to test for the basics. And if they're interested in learning more, they can start learning more and more of the tools. But really, anyone who's willing to learn how to can test for these accessibility improvements. So let's start looking at how. There are many different ways that people can consume apps, whether that's screen readers like TalkBack on Android or VoiceOver on iOS. That's one way people can consume apps. It allows people to traverse the screen, sometimes without touch, and understand what's on the screen without sight. Some familiar ways to think about this might be using an app on a TV, using next and select buttons. Another thought about how people might use your phone would be by using the assistant or voice control to navigate your phone. Another tool that people use are displaying the font size or display bigger for people with low visibility, or if their phone just needs to be farther away from them. And then there's also color corrections to help people with colorblindness, or if you just prefer your phone to be in a different color palette. And then how can we test if our app is accessible? One is manual user testing. This is one of the most reliable and comprehensive ways. Manual would be using the tools I mentioned before to manually walk through the app, turn on TalkBack, see what it's like to use. your app using TalkBack, bump up that text size, make sure everything is still readable and nothing's being cut off. You can fully read everything that you need to read. You can also do user testing with people who use these services and see what their experience is and get feedback from them. There's also scanners that you can use that scan and locate some of the easier things that can be automated to look for, such as touch target size and contrast. There's one called Accessibility Scanner. For iOS, there's Accessibility Inspector. Axe is also a scanner that you can use. You can also add automated tests. In your Espresso test, Espresso has a library that you can just add accessibility checks to your existing UI tests. So with that, you don't have to write any new tests. Plugging this in will automatically give you some things that you can improve. And then finally, for some basic things that can be caught at the code level, there are lint checks, such as did you add a content description for this view? Kind of a preview of what the Accessibility Scanner app looks like. The first screenshot here is the Accessibility Scanner in the Play Store. It's from Google, so you can kind of see what you're looking for when you go to download this in the Play Store. Then once you turn it on, you can scan a screen of the app. The center one is it scanned one of the views in the Play Store. There's orange boxes around what some suggestion areas are. And then you can drill down into that suggestion, get some more details. These are similar errors that are brought up by the Espresso testing framework. So you can kind of use both of them to find different things. And then once things are brought up, you can make the decision if it needs to be fixed and how you want to fix it. So now we're going to dig into some elements of accessibility and how you can make your app more accessible. We're going to do this by looking at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. And we're specifically going to look at version 2.1 because it adds some additional things specifically for mobile. I hear that they're soon coming out with 2.2, which I'm very excited about. I want to go see what things are added there. We don't have time to go over everything here, but we will hit some of the things that you're most likely to run into. So you can kind of think of this as a sample platter. The goal is that when you're making a product decision, you can think back and remember, I think there was an accessibility argument for that. Let me remind myself before deciding. So WCAG uses 4 categories to organize the guidelines, and we're going to follow each of these. And we'll describe what these dimensions are and then dig a little deeper into how you can support them. With the first being perceivable. This requires thinking about ways that people can consume content. Can everything on the screen be read with a screen reader? If there's an audio cue, is there another way to receive the cue? And that brings us to our next question. What is a way people can perceive your app? So go ahead and go back to Menti, type in your ideas. One example might be audio, another might be the touch screen, but there's lots of different ways that people can perceive and get information from your app. So while you are in there adding those answers, let's start talking about some different ways that you can improve the perceivability of your app. And the first is labeling. The purpose of this one is mainly for people using screen readers. This is especially for images and buttons without readable text. Otherwise, the screen reader might say something like unlabeled button, which isn't very helpful when you're trying to figure out what this button does. The user might not perceive that what the button is supposed to do in this case. Sure, for someone who can see the button, they might see like a pencil and assume that it's an edit button. But if you're using a screen reader and all you hear is unlabeled button, it's not clear what this button does. One exception for this is if an image doesn't need to be perceived to operate your app, like if it's a decoration, like a divider or a gradient or something. In that case, you should set it up that the screen reader knows it can skip it. You do this through content descriptions. If you want to skip it, one way to do this, there's multiple, but one way is to set the content description to @null. And then you want to make sure inputs are clearly labeled with what they're for. So you can use the label for attribute to say if a label is for a specific field. There's also labels for headers. So there's plenty of labels to look into. You also need to consider time-based media. Not everyone can watch videos or listen to audio. If you have an onboarding tutorial video, is there text to go with it? Maybe captions. Does your app use audio cues? Imagine downloading a new app and not being able to get past onboarding because you can't access the instructions in a way you can perceive. It also helps if you download an app and you don't want to watch the onboarding video because there's a sleeping kid next to you and you don't want to wake them up. And then you should also allow rewinding and skipping. And this is for a variety of reasons. One, the movement in a video could cause nausea for some. It could cause others anxiety if they feel they missed something and they can't go back, or they feel there's limited time to absorb some bit of information. People with motor or cognitive disabilities might need more time to consume the information. Finally, motion and animation can be distracting for some people and detract from what you're trying to communicate. It can also help if you download an app and you miss the onboarding video because you have maybe an awake and very loud kid next to you. Most screen readers will traverse the screen from top start to bottom end. It does depend a little bit depending on the system, but this is the direction a lot of them take. This also happens to be the way most humans consume content. So think about that when you're laying out your content. You also want to group things together that should be read at the same time, such as maybe a label and a value. This not only helps people who use screen readers, but also if you want to build your app for Chromebook or macOS or TV. It prevents you from having to scroll to multiple things. If you have a total and then $5, you want to read total $5, not total. Okay, go to the next view, $5. In this screenshot, it is again of the Play Store. At the bottom, there is a green box at the bottom around previously installed apps. Then there's the subtext, give one a go, and then an arrow. These are all grouped together so it's all read together and you can tap on the whole thing in order to perform the action. Because of this, you don't have to go previously installed apps, next view, give one a go, next view, then the arrow, and then click. It's all grouped together because it's all related and logically should be together. Next, we're going to talk about sensory cues. If you're trying to communicate something to your user, don't rely only on one of these things because one of them might not be perceivable, such as shape or color, size, visual location, orientation, or sound. So if you say, tap the green button, it might not be clear what button is green. And then another example might be when an error pops up on the screen, it's just indicated that, I don't know, something's red. There's no actual message. Does someone who's using a screen reader know that there's a new error if just a color changed? This helps anyone who might have looked away from their phone for a moment and missed the transition as well. They might not have noticed that the size of something or the color of something or the location has changed if they didn't physically watch that transition happen. Another thing that is part of the accessibility guidelines is to allow both portrait and landscape. There are some exceptions, like specifically for games or maybe a camera, but you should support both where you can. Imagine having your phone mounted up on, I don't know, say the dashboard of your car. And when you're driving, you don't want to switch the orientation or fiddle with it. And if one could say you can't. You want your navigation app to support whatever orientation you put it on. And similarly, if someone is mounting their phone, say on their wheelchair, you want to support whatever orientation they have it mounted on. And then this is also helpful for other people who might just feel more comfortable using their phone with a specific orientation, such as when they're using it with one hand because their other hand is busy, again, carrying groceries. Another one that is often brought up is color contrast. Make sure you have adequate color contrast on both text with words as well as images. So any text that needs to be distinguishable needs to have a contrast of 7:1 for most text and 4.5:1 for large text. Exceptions include things like decorations or logos. There are similar contrast rules for other controls like buttons that need to be perceivable. I like using digital well-being to make my phone grayscale after a certain time at night. And if an app doesn't have adequate color contrast, it becomes hard for me to use too. Like, kind of simulates colorblindness or other vision impairments. Similar to audio and other visual cues, it shouldn't be the only way that you communicate something. For example, don't only use red and green to show something is a success or failure. You should also use something like icons or text in case the colors aren't perceptible. I have an app that uses color as one way to show if an answer is right or wrong, and once my phone becomes grayscale, the app is a lot more difficult to use. And then font and display size. If someone has the font size bumped way up, you should still be able to use your app like normal. As we all age and our vision deteriorates, we'll all be thankful for this one. One of the easiest ways to violate this is if you assume a text view will always be under a certain height or width. In the case of when text views are next to each other, constraint layout flows can help bump a view below a view if they're originally next to each other. If they run out of space, you can bump that view below it. And then just here is a side-by-side of large size versus the default size. You can see, for example, recommended for you is ellipse-sized. When you're making these decisions, if you're going to ellipse-size or maybe allow multiple lines, think about, is it necessary for the user to be able to perceive this full text? Next, we're going to talk about operable. This is basically like, can you perform the actions that you need to in the app? Can you perform it and navigate using the keyboard or talk back? Are buttons big enough to press? So with that, we'll go to our next question, and that is, what is a way people can operate your app? One example might be using the touchscreen. So go ahead and type in some possible answers to this. I see that there are some coming in. Some other ones that I'd like to point out, it's kind of hard to catch which ones are already in, is you might use the touch screen, you might use gestures, you can use audio to navigate your app. You can also do switch access using a switch, and lots of others. I see some really good ones coming in. So continue to type those in. We're going to talk about how you can improve the operability of your app. And one of the best ways to figure out how your app performs, especially with navigation, is try it out yourself or watch someone else try it. Try using the screen reader, and as you walk through the screen, can you reach everything that's on it? Does it make logical order? An example of something that might not make logical sense is to have a submit button at the top of a page rather than at the end of a form. Are there things that are grouped in a way that makes sense? Is something repetitive? And if the user reaches a button on the screen, is it clear what action it performs? And this is more than just for a screen reader. It can cause anxiety for your user if they don't know what will happen when they press a button. Finally, this is another case that would make it possible to build your app for a desktop or a TV. When you're thinking about operability, again, you need to think about timing, and this is for a lot of reasons. If something is showing and hiding, someone who is slower at consuming the information might miss it. This could be because of a disability or simply because of an outside distraction, and they might not click on a thing that they need to click on. And this is a similar argument for those with motor disabilities. It's also better for users with anxiety to not have those time limits to contribute to any anxious feelings. And again, there are exceptions for this one. For example, if something goes out of stock or it's a time-based game, it's kind of hard to remove those time restrictions. Another thing to note around timing is that you should avoid any flashing things, both because of the seizure risk and also because things are just harder to perceive when they're flashing. And then gestures and pointers, this might cover things that take multiple fingers, such as a pinch to zoom in and out or swiping. In the case that someone isn't able to perform a gesture for one reason or another, there should be another way to accomplish that task. An idea of an additional way to access functionality by, instead of like pinching to zoom, might be a slider or arrow buttons. And for single touch actions, there should be a way to back out or undo. This might be if you move the finger off the button before you lift it, the action isn't performed, and this is the default behavior for our click listeners on buttons. Or having an undo or back option is another possibility. And these options are good for everyone, especially in the case for one-handed use, and you might touch something that you didn't mean to. And then touch targets. Have you ever visited a website or even an app on your phone that you struggled to click on a link or a button that was just too small? You're sitting there trying to figure out if you can zoom in on this web page. You just have clumsy fingers that day and you have trouble clicking that link. The recommended size for Android is 48 by 48 dp for anything clickable or interactable. So make sure that your touch targets are at least 48 dp. This also has the benefit of making the actions in your app more clear. All right, I know we've only gone through two of the properties we were going to talk about. The next two are a lot shorter. So first is understandable. Not only can your content be perceived, but can it be understood? This includes things like limiting abbreviations or idioms. Is it clear why something errored? Is everything communicated effectively? One way to do this is through using language. Internationalizing and localizing, which can be a whole talk in itself, is part of this, but not the only way to make your app more understandable. You can also avoid hard to read words and idioms, which are usually culturally specific. Avoiding long blocks of text improve the experience for everyone, and really, who actually reads long blocks of text if you're not reading a blog post or a book? And it makes for a better experience for users with autism as well. You want your content to be easily digestible. And then how many times have you run into an abbreviation and you don't know, and then it makes you feel maybe old or awkward because you had to go look up this abbreviation that all the cool kids are using now? Don't do that to your users. Spell out what you mean, give the full version the first time, and then use the abbreviation after if you do want to use the abbreviation. And then the same can go for emojis and icons. Symbols don't always mean the same thing for everyone. And then on the flip side, pairing icons with text can help improve understandability. Some people comprehend words better, and for others, images are easier. And then you want your app to be consistent. You want things to be consistent for everyone. Are you using send or submit throughout the app? Is there a consistent workflow that you have? It pays to have consistent layout and ordering throughout the app. It makes the app so much easier to navigate for everyone. This is especially true for people using screen readers and users with autism. Finally, you don't want to change the context of where you are in the app to change unless an action is performed to cause that change, such as pressing a button. And this brings down confusion of like, where am I in the app and how did I get here? A very mini version of this might be if you click in an input field and the hint or label goes away. What if the user gets distracted or pulled away and they come back and it's unclear to them what they're supposed to type in because they can no longer see that hint? All right, then finally, robust. If you're using native components, this one is mostly taken care of for you. Robust is just that no matter which service they're using, it can be used, it can be perceived, it can be operated. So we won't spend extra time on it here. This is something you might want to look into if you have a highly customizable and interactive views, like if you're drawing directly to the canvas and using custom views there. So with that, make sure your custom view is hooked into the accessibility services correctly. If you're simply extending an existing view, like an existing button, you might not have much to do. It might just be taken care of, but the more custom work that you're doing, the more you want to check on this. One additional note that I want to add here is that the more configurable you make your app, the more accessible it will be it for color schemes, audio settings, animations, and more. Everyone, regardless of ability, has different needs and preferences. If you let others use the app in a way that's best for them, it will mean a more quality product. And with that, I want to say, in the end, build quality apps because you care about having a quality app, and build accessible apps for the caring world you want to live in. With that, I want to thank you for listening. I'm here for any questions as long as the video call is open. I'm also available online with that after. You can catch me in Slack, in the Slack channel for this talk. You can also find me on Twitter at @ttgonda or LinkedIn. All of the slides and my resources can be found on my website, victoriagonda.com. They are also in the Slack channel, and I posted them on Twitter. So with that, I have one final question for you. What things can you remember to look for to keep your app accessible? What is maybe 3 different takeaways that you want to take from this talk? Go ahead and put them in the word cloud. You can put as many as you want. You can repeat something that you said before if it's really important to you. And with that, let's see if there are any questions. All right, I'm taking a peek here. I don't see any questions yet. If you think of any after this, feel free to find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, in Slack, and I'm happy to answer any questions there. Again, all of my resources are available. I'm also going to post a screenshot of this word cloud that we created together in Slack and on Twitter. There are some really great things in here, and it was, I hope, fun for you to put together. And I will hang out in this talk or in this Zoom call for a little bit longer in case any questions come up. And with that, thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you.
So if somebody has any questions, they can post it in the chat or the Slack. Otherwise, we can end the Zoom.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Any questions, folks? Here we go. Here we go.
All right.